And here at Kane, you have a student license, so you shouldn't have a problem with that. But assuming you're an experimental, you're going to want to click, you see my cursor moving about here, new data set. So that allows you to start from scratch. Hang on, cancel. I did not. New data set. All right, so it should pop up a screen. Now, if you look at my cursor at the bottom, and I'm going to do full screen for visibility purposes, you'll see at the bottom there's data view and variable view, right? And now I'm going to take you through the various columns, what they are, what they do, how they're used. Now, in all fairness, this is just a primer, so there are things that go beyond the common. If you have any questions, ask your instructor. That would be useful. But the first column is called name. And as I mentioned, name can only be one word. So, for example, let's say I had a question called, what is your age, right? So what would be an appropriate name for that variable?
Age.
Age, that's right. So age would be a very good example for name, right? So now, you'll notice it's one word. It can be capitalized, it can be lowercase, either way is fine. The next column is called variable type. And when you get to that column on the right side, there's a box. If you click the right side, a pop-up screen will come, and you'll notice that it says variable type. You'll also notice that it starts as numeric. The reason why it starts as numeric because SPSS is for quantitative methods. It's typically the most common data you're going to use in SPSS is numeric. Now, I'm going to march you through the width and decimal places, even though they're separate columns. Each column has its own benefit. So when we talk about width, width is the number of spaces before the decimal, and decimal places are the number of spaces after the decimal. So you'll notice that the default is 8. So that would mean the highest number you can enter into SPSS with this width would be 99,999,999. And then the decimal places, this is 2 decimal places or spaces after the decimal. Now, so the default is numeric. Let's change it to string. There are certain kind of variables called string variables, and if you had a data management software like we have at Kane called Qualtrics, right, you can actually have them type in their responses. So here, instead of it being coded as a number, these are actual words, right? So for example, if I wanted to ask a person what country do they, or what state do they reside in, string variables would be appropriate. So you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's something called characters. The default is 8. I encourage people to change it to 1,000, as I just did, and click OK. Now, you'll notice when I click OK, something interesting happens. I change the variable to string, the width is at 1,000, and the decimals go down to 0. Why might that be? Well, sorry, I caught you sleeping. All right, now the decimal, because it's in words, there are no decimals, right? Yes. So it wouldn't be a numerical thing, it's more words. Now, another reason why I say to change it to 1,000 is, if, for example, if I ask the person what state do they reside in, you couldn't write every single state with 8 spaces, right? So a state like New Hampshire, you would run out of characters, right? So I change it to 1,000 so a person might be able to write more. But it drops out the decimals because, again, it's now written as words, not numbers. Now I'm going to change it back to what it should be, right? Age, people report as a number, so I'm going to change it back to numeric. Now because I changed it back to numeric, you're going to notice that the previous settings of width and decimals got all screwy, right? So now it's still at that 1,000. It's thinking 1,000 characters. But in numbers, let's put it back to the default of 8 as the width and 2 as the decimal places. Okay? and you click OK, and you'll notice where my cursor is at the top, the 8 is now back in place, the 2 is back in place. Now the label and the name of the variable are linked. So if I were to ask a person their age, right, here you could actually write the full sentence. What is your age, right? So you'll see it for a label, it allows you to write full questions. Now I'm going to stretch this out a bit so you can actually see that whereas the name of the variable has to be one word, the label can actually be multiple words. Now values. Values in this context are not going to be necessary, but values are when you have different categories. So I'm going to go out of order and just to demonstrate what values look like. So if I were to ask a person about their ethnicity, let's make a new variable called ethnicity. Okay, now we're going to make a label as what ethnic group do you most identify with? So now we have a full question. Now, if I go into the label or into the values section and I click the right side, there are different ethnic categories, right? I don't want to go into a full diversity lesson on this, but for our simplistic purposes, can you give me an example of an ethnic category?
Black or African American.
Good, right? So according to American Psychological Association, Black or African American would be appropriate. So we're going to label the value number as 1, and we're going to call that Black or African American, and we're going to click, I misspelled that, African American, right? And I'm going to hit enter. Notice I'm not clicking OK. You don't want to click OK till you have all of your labels in there. You'll also notice I started with the value of 1, right? Because typically you want to use 0 when it is an absolute 0, right? This is just categories. So I'm going to hit enter, and you'll notice it shifted from the value labels down into the lower section of the box. So another example of an ethnic category would be Hispanic, right? So Hispanic. Now, according to U.S. Census, Hispanic is actually a race, not an ethnicity, but it's okay. Most people would put it in a race, ethnic category. So Hispanic, Latino are interchangeable according to American Psychological Association. But we'll do Hispanic, not Caucasian. And that's just the way it's written typically. Hit enter again, and sure enough, we have now 2 categories in here. We have Black or African American, we have Hispanic, non-Caucasian or not Caucasian. So since I mentioned Caucasian, I might as well put white or Caucasian. Just a little note about whenever you use the term white or black, you want to capitalize the letter because we're not talking about Crayola colors. We're actually talking about race or ethnic categories. So you'll notice that the B of black and the W of white are capitalized. Just a random aside. Now, we could go on however many ethnic groups there are, but this is just a tutorial. So I'm going to leave these 3 there. And now, let's say I listed all of my values and all my labels. So I had all my options there. I'm going to click OK. And now they're listed in the values. Now, you'll notice, as I said, we start in variable view because we're giving the backdrop or how we're going to code our variables. Now, I don't touch missing, I don't touch columns, I don't touch alignment. They're not really that relevant. But now, the next one we want to talk about are the measures. Now, I'm going to go back up to the first variable, which is age. And the default, it had it listed as nominal. If I ask a person their age, is that really a nominal variable? Let me just click the drop down and talk to you about that. It's not, right? So when we say nominal, it really means categorical or in name only. There's no greater or less than. There's no better or worse. It's just categorical differences. So when we have nominal data, typically there's no greater or less than. Then we have ordinal data. Ordinal data puts things into rank order, but the units of measure are not equivalent. An example of ordinal data is I'm going to be traveling, right? So I'm going to go to a hotel. And of course, because I'm a very critical consumer, I have to read the number of stars, and each hotel has a star rating. But the difference between a 1-star, I call these pay by the, never mind, I'm going to leave that alone. A 1-star accommodation versus a 2-star, it's 1 star, but the amount of amenities you get is much greater than if you were to compare a 4-star and a 5-star. In fact, if you travel a lot, a 4-star accommodation versus a 5-star are virtually negligible. But you notice the difference between a 1-star and a 2-star, right? I'll leave all my jokes aside. Now, scale, if this were a research methods class, I would say scale refers to data that is either interval or ratio. Now, in SPSS, interval data or ratio data are considered scale. Now, what is interval data? Interval data means that you have equal units of measure, but you do not have an absolute value of absolute 0. So a nice example would be temperature, right? In fact, here in New York, New Jersey area, the Northeast, it gets really cold in the winter, right? And they say we have sub-zero temperature. If 0 was truly 0, there should not be anything called sub-zero, right? So 0 degrees Fahrenheit isn't the absence of temperature. 0 degrees Celsius even isn't the absence of temperature, right? So you can have sub-zero temperatures. So that's interval, right? Now, the difference between 1 degree and the next are equivalent. Now, ratio data actually has an absolute 0. So that I always joke, like if a person took a test in my class and it was a 20-item test and they got none of them right, 0 means 0. There's no such thing as getting below 0. Now, granted, in my class I curve, so even in that case they probably wouldn't get a 0, but they got 0 questions correct. So 0 means 0. So again, to summarize, nominal is categorical differences, no greater, less than. Ordinal, you have greater than or less than. We know a 1-star is worse than a 2-star, and a 3-star is better than a 2, and vice versa. But they're not equal units of measure. When we get to scale, we have equal units of measure, and the only difference is whether you have an absolute 0 or not. So age. Of these 3, nominal, ordinal, or scale, which one do you think it should be? Good job, scale, right? Because a year is a year, right? And we know that there are 365 days in a year, which is equal unit, with the exception of a leap year. So we're going to call this scale, and that's that. Now, when it comes to ethnicity, what unit of measure do you think ethnicity should be? So I'm going to do my drop box, and that is correct.
Nominal?
It is nominal. So again, because unless you are a nationalist and you have racist tendencies, we know that one ethnic group is not inherently better than another, right? They're just categorically different, and that's what it is. So now we have age, we have ethnicity. Let's mess around with a couple more before we go into data view. Okay, so gender, right? So let's make gender an option. So again, notice it pops down as your type is numeric, your width is 8, decimals are 2. The question might be, what is your gender? What I always like to say identify, because gender identification is important. What gender do you most identify with? Now, again, this is going to be another example where values matter, right? So here, 1, what would be an example of a gender? Good, right? So male, 2, female, 3, because we're not talking about biological sex, you can have transgender, And I always like to put another option for as prefer not to answer. Now there are many, pardon me, I misspelled two. There are many different gender identities, and this is not an all-exhaustive list. In fact, I think it would be a cool exercise for students to go on Facebook and see all the various options. There's tons more, but I'm just going to do, for stylistic purposes, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right? And we're going to click OK again. Notice I only click OK when I'm done with all my categories. So missing is I'm going to leave that blank. Column, I'm going to leave blank. Alignment is where the data set goes. It's defaulted to align right. Now with gender is an interesting one, right? Because what would that be? It's nominal, right? But if I would ask the question differently in terms of masculinity and femininity, and I put it on a spectrum, then it changes from a category to we can quantify it numerically, right? And there are tons of scales. In fact, Daryl and Sandra Bem do a lot of research on gender roles and gender identity, and they've actually quantified masculine and femininity in pretty cool ways, which are loaded to gender. Okay, so we have a scale question, we have a nominal question. What kind of question is absent?
Oh, what kind of question?
Yeah.
Something under ordinal?
Ordinal, right? So ordinal data, it's interesting because there's a debate, but most people treat Likert scales. I know some people call it Likert, but it's actually pronounced Likert. Likert scales are actually viewed as ordinal. So let's make a little bit of an interesting question. Perhaps it's a little bit controversial, but rate your level of support for the current presidential administration.
What's the scale?
Okay, so again, I'm going to write the question out and then we're going to come up with a name for it. Rate your level of support for the current presidential administration. Now, this is a demo, and I know it's going to be controversial regardless of the presidential group, because that's politics, but I'm doing it anyway. So that's my prompt. Now, because I didn't name the variable, you'll notice it says variable 0001. We're going to call this, and I'm going to do a demo. Remember how we said that it can only be one word, right? So we're going to call this variable presidential support. Now, first I'm going to write it in a way that it's going to give me an error message, and then I'm going to write it the way you can write it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do, hang on, let me delete this. Wait, what happened? I think I deleted a couple of my variables. Okay, well, so I'm going to write this as presidential support. Now, you'll notice that I put a space there. I'm going to demonstrate when you have that space there that it's going to come up as an error message because the name of your variable cannot have a space. So I'm going to hit enter, and sure enough, it says variable name contains an illegal character. So say, oh shoot, that's right. So let me click OK. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this. I want to call my variable presidential support, right? Presidential underscore support. Now, it's the same variable, same words, but because I used an underscore, it doesn't treat it as two words. It treats it as one. So I'm going to hit enter. And in fact, I'm going to stretch this out so you can actually see it. Right? So you see presidential underscore support, it will accept. But if you use a space, it treats as an illegal character. And something happened where my labels got deleted. Okay, so we're going to do rate your level of support for the current presidential administration. Okay, so now I have my prompt. Now the values, remember the whole purpose in doing this is ordinal. It's a Likert scale, so we're going to do from lowest to highest of support. So we're going to do 1 is strongly disapprove. And then the second one would be disapprove. 3, and we're going to do it on a 5-point scale. 3 would be neutral. Good job. So we're going to make that neutral. Now, you could say, you could write it differently, neither approve nor disapprove, but we're just going to do it as neutral. 4 would be approve. And then 5 would be strongly approve. And now I have my levels of support. Now, obviously, even though the numbers are equal, how do we quantify levels of support by categories like this? We know it's going up in its level of support, but it's hard to determine that each unit of measure is equivalent, and that's the reason why in a Likert scale it's treated as ordinal. Okay, so I'm going to click OK, and now I have 4 fictitious variables. Let's stop here, and when we do the next video, what's going to happen is I'm going to go into data view. So let's stop here.